The Emperor Palpatine of
right.
Al-Qaeda.
That's what he is, right? He's the guy behind. He's pulling all of the strings. He's manipulating all of the people. He's coming up with a narrative, right? That's the most important thing to me. He's coming up with the thoughts and the ideas and the words that he's going to put into the mouth of Osama bin Laden.
Islam will continue to be triumphant until there have been 12 Khulafa, all of them from Al-Quraysh.
The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever.
This is my brother, my executor, and my successor among you, so listen to him and obey.
My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting.
Whoso obeys me obeys God. Whoever disobeys me disobeys God. Whoever disobeys my commander disobeys me.
The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession.
Two systems of government, two visions for life on earth. Whichever is true changes everything. This is Christ and Khulafa.
We're back for the Christ and Caliphate podcast, and today we are joined by the ghost of Al Zawahiri.
Spooky. Yeah. I wonder, looking at him in a picture behind bars, how his life would have turned out differently if he had just stayed there. Right?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, like in a prison setting. Maybe radicalizing people from the inside. But
So, honestly, one of my first takeaways from kind of like researching this guy is actually how much better journalism was in 2002.
Yes, right.
Like reading that like New York Post article about him, which is just super balanced, super concerned about facts,
Right.
like represents him in his own words. It's like nothing like what you get today.
Yeah. To contrast that, on the way over here, I listened to MSNBC. What's her name? Jane. I can't remember her name.
Maddow?
Yeah.
No, that's Rachel Maddow.
Rachel Maddow. That's it. Giving, for the most part, a really like balanced approach to everything that he had done and all of the terrorist activity that had taken place of and the things that he masterminded and all that other stuff. But then at the end, it was like, and Biden killed him. Right? It was Biden closing the chapter on 9/11. It was Biden getting to the bottom of it. And now it's over. And I was like, isn't that just like the way, right? Like no matter whoever's like telling the story of a guy like this is like at the end, right? It's America who fixed it. It's over, But it's not fixed. It's obviously not fixed.
Yeah, there's this hardworking CIA agent somewhere who's been for months getting this vast network of intelligence carefully putting dots together.
Right.
And then, Biden wakes up in the morning, drinks his coffee, and somebody says, "Sir, we're about to kill Al Zawahiri." It's like, "Oh, neat!" And then Biden's face on Time magazine. The man who killed Al Zawahiri.
Right.
And every president does it, right? Trump killed Baghdadi.
Right.
Obama killed Osama bin Laden.
Right.
Bush caught Saddam Hussein, right?
Right.
Everybody has their own, like, trophy mounted on the wall of the White House.
Right.
Somewhere.
Of some bad guy. Yeah.
So, going back to what you said about his life turning out different, it's a little... I think one of the scariest things reading about his life is kind of... Not that it's normal, but... It's not some, like, crazy, grizzled backstory. Like, his backstory is, he grows up in, like, the wealthy part of town. He's
Right.
part of a slightly more
Yep.
religious, conservative family.
Sure.
And basically...
But successful.
Successful.
Very successful.
Very
Right.
successful.
So we're talking politicians. We're talking also religious imams. We're talking, influence in the medical community, influence in the political sphere, all of those things.
Right. So his grandfather is, like, the lead guy at Al-Azhar.
Right.
Which is basically the highest post religiously in the Sunni Muslim world as far as prestige.
It's the Harvard of...
Yeah.
Sorry, Oxford. I know you're English. It's the Oxford.
It works. We can make Al-Azhar Harvard and, like, Medina or Mecca,
There
Oxford.
you go.
Right?
There you go. There you
Oxford is Mecca, Medina is Cambridge. we're probably taking these comparisons too
go.
far.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Yeah, maybe. It depends on how you look at it.
So we have this guy who comes from privileged circumstances, is an exceptional student in a lot of ways. Exceptional in the way that he's really good.
Right.
So there's this story of how his sister is always studying really hard, and he's always kind of not really studying, but sort of acing
Right.
every test he takes and like being top of his class in every subject.
Sure.
And it's, I think there's this narrative in the West that these terrorists are unsophisticated, uneducated farmers somewhere who are just, angry about things they don't understand without any kind of complex thinking.
Right.
Behind this is a brilliant man.
Right.
On,
literally, the article calls him a genius.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like in every way imaginable.
I think it was one passage in the article where I talked about how
Lean it into the mic.
how there was this one passage in the article talked about a childhood friend of his saying that he was quiet and it was almost like he was trying to solve a puzzle, right, in the back of his head at all times, right, like trying to slowly, quietly build this, what a mastermind would do, right, the things that a mastermind would do, sorting out all of the facts and putting them in an arranged way that was, systematic, right? That's the word the article uses, systematic.
Yeah, he's clearly a very careful thinker, and you see this thread throughout his life that he has this, he's zealous, but he's also very restrained and disciplined.
Sure.
And so really, Al-Qaeda would never have been the force it was without this guy. Like essentially, Osama bin Laden is like the movie star.
Right.
But this guy is like the producer, the writer, the director.
Right.
Behind all this. He's the sort of brains behind everything.
Right.
And I think one thing that should immediately just shoot dead is this idea that solving the world's problems is entirely done through education.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, I think earlier you had said that the difference was that he was a genius, and most people perceive that your average jihadi is an uneducated, essentially like a hick, right? Even the article uses that, right? Like categorizing people from northern Egypt. But maybe that's true of like the foot soldier, kind of mentality of it, right? Like I guess you'd call them the grunts, right? The grunts would be, coming more easily manipulated by rhetoric, but not this guy. This guy is the initiator of the rhetoric, right?
Right.
He's the one who comes up with the words and the plans and the way to kind of move people's hearts. And combined with Bin Laden, you could see that Bin Laden's charisma, along with this guy's strategy, and the nuts and bolts behind it, are really what's initiating this thing that we now know as Al Qaeda.
Yeah. So think of Al Zawahiri as this sort of indie movie producer with complex ideas.
Right.
And Osama bin Laden is like the wealthy movie star with wealth and star power who serves as executive producer of Al Qaeda.
Right.
Who is then the combination of these two guys is what makes Al Qaeda work as an organization.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair.
So in some ways, while killing Osama bin Laden was obviously a huge deal,
right,
this is actually probably a bigger deal. At least it would have been 10 years ago anyway.
Yeah. I think it was kind of glossed over.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, we're struggling as a country at a lot of different measures, and a lot of people's focus has shifted from, the war on terror, right, or American involvement overseas in Muslim countries or Islamic countries, has shifted back to like we're running on domestic issues here, political, in this election cycle, right? Like it's inflation, it's Trump, it's the January 6th commission. There's on a lower level the withdrawal from Afghanistan and all that other stuff. But yeah, it was glossed over. It's honestly interesting because I knew it happened, but I forgot.
Yeah, right.
3 weeks ago.
Also, I think we're at a sort of phase where Al Qaeda is kind of past its glory days.
Right.
So, I think, well, let's kind of get back into that a little bit. So, we have this guy who's this exceptional young man. He's a brilliant student, comes from money, comes from influence, comes from power, and he channels all of that brilliance into these sort of Salafi Muslim ideas. Mm-hmm. So let's break down what that is, right?
Go.
So with this idea of Salafism is this idea that the first 3 generations of Muslims were the greatest people to ever have lived. And the way to attain righteousness on earth is to get as close to that ideal as you possibly can. So when we have these, after the sort of Allied powers withdrew from the Middle East after the First and Second World Wars, you had all these Arab governments formed that were trying to figure out, okay, well, which way are we going to go? Are we going to go join the capitalists and be secular democracies?
Right.
Are we going to join the communists and have socialist economies?
Right.
And so Egypt's going that way, and then a lot of places are going for capitalist dictatorships.
Sure.
Basically.
Sure.
And so what this means is that people like Al Zawahiri and people with his worldview pose a threat to these secular dictatorships, because what they are going to do is they're going to look at the problems in the Middle East, they're going to look at the kind of humiliation they've suffered in these world wars and the poverty of their societies compared to the riches of the West, and they're going to say, the reason we're at the bottom of the pecking order in the world is because our ancestors and our leaders have abandoned true Islam.
Right.
And we need to return to this ideal, and that is the sort of beginning of their political advocacy. So, in his early career, Al Zawahiri's sights are firmly fixed on Egypt,
Right.
on other countries in the Muslim world, and his philosophy is you deal with the near enemy first, and then you deal with a far enemy, which
Right.
is the U.S.
Right. And by 1998, right, we know that's, he had declared war. By 1998, he had declared war on the West. So you can see it because later on that year, that's when they attacked the embassies in Africa, Tanzania and Kenya, right? So 200 people dead, 4,000 injured, and that's the initiation of, okay, we have taken this operation beyond trying to liberate, and I use the quotations, Muslim countries from Western ideology, and using it, now we're actually going to hit them where it hurts. We're going to hit them in their embassies. They attacked the USS Cole, and then later on, in the year 2001, we all know what happened, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so basically, the shift for that happens after the war in Afghanistan. So, when Binny met Ayman, right. Happens.
Binny and Ayman instead of Benny and June.
Yeah. So that happened. So basically, what happens is both of them are drawn to this cause of these Islamic Muslim fighters. It's kind of redundant to say Islamic Muslims. It's the same word.
Understandable.
But sort of these mujahideen fighting against the secular Soviet powers, and Osama bin Laden comes with a sense of jihad and strict Islam without many political ideas and a lot of money.
Right.
Ayman Al Zawahiri already has his political and social ideology all kind of outlined and a plan in place.
Right.
So when Osama bin Laden meets Ayman Al Zawahiri,
Right.
there's this, okay, you are my hetero life partner.
Right. It's true. You can see that, right? He became his doctor. He became his mentor. He became, Rachel Maddow put it, the COO of, operations of Al-Qaeda when the two organizations merged. That happens a little bit later on in the story. But, he's definitely an inspirational figure. He's definitely a father figure in a lot of ways. And actually, while I was reading all of this, I was like, why is there always a need for a father figure, right? There's always this person in the background who's, in a good way, it could be like, I don't know, like Moses and Joshua, right?
Yeah.
But in a bad way, it's Vader and Anakin, right?
Yeah,
Right.
the Emperor Palpatine of
Right.
Al-Qaeda.
That's what he is, right? He's the guy behind. He's pulling all of the strings. He's manipulating all of the people. He's coming up with a narrative, right? That's the most important thing to me. He's coming up with the thoughts and the ideas and the words that he's going to put into the mouth of Osama bin Laden or really anyone who would listen to him as a means of mobilizing radical Islam, right? Like creating jihadis and putting them in a position where their hearts and their minds and their actions are all bought into this idea of violent jihad against the West. And, that's what Sith do.
So after the Afghanistan war, they have success in Afghanistan, and the goal of moving there is one, to defeat the Soviets, but also to use it as a sort of blank slate to build their ideal Muslim country.
Right.
So Al Zawahiri, he decided he couldn't do it in Egypt because everything's like based around the Nile, which means there's nowhere to like hide in Egypt. Because if you want to go hide in caves in Egypt, you're just not near any water.
Right.
You can't have any like viable supply lines. Whereas Afghanistan is vast, mountainous,
Right.
and there's all sorts of places to hide, so you can kind of build a base there.
Audience who is not familiar with this, think Iron Man 1.
Yeah. But probably with more water.
With more water, yeah.
But then after trying more things in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both these things keep getting squashed by the governments of these countries. So I think it's really, really important for us to note here that Al-Zawahiri and bin Laden don't represent their respective countries.
Right.
We shouldn't take them as a summary of Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
Right.
Because these people are primarily rebels against their own governments who see their vision of Islam as a threat to these governments.
Right. And I think it's important to note that even the people who inspired Al-Zawahiri is one of them is essentially a revolutionary, right? Qutb.
Yep.
In Egypt, and he, tries to assassinate Sadat, right? Tries to assassinate Anwar Sadat. Spends 15 years in jail. Kind of becomes like a jailed murder, right? Like dies essentially, in prison, or no, he's executed. They hung him. Yeah. So the military the government that he was opposing. I mean, we need to make this clear, right? So the governments that these guys are opposing are not great governments to begin with.
Right.
They oppress their people. They're militaristic. They're authoritarian. They shut down democracy. Those kinds of things. And the means by which they're trying to gain reform, right, is not peaceful.
Right.
That's the difference. It's weaponizing Islam and embracing terroristic tactics, right? So
two strategies we can count now, which did not work in stopping Al-Zawahiri. One is education.
Right.
Like he was super educated.
Right.
The other thing that doesn't work is force.
Right.
They killed Sayyid Qutb in the thoughts that you could kind of kill an idea.
Right.
But you can't. Because
Right.
this isn't a battle between educated people and
Right.
uneducated people.
Right.
It's a battle between worldviews and ideas.
And I actually feel like that entire premise of, people in these countries, particularly where Islamic radical jihad finds a foothold, are uneducated. I mean, it's interesting because, we're filming this at a Messianic congregation right now. And the idea in Judaism is like education. It's no different in the Muslim world, right? Like there's so many people in all of these countries who have degrees. They have degrees. They have degrees in computer science. They have degrees in electrical engineering. They have degrees in medicine and all of these other things, and they have no opportunity to be able to actually get jobs that pay. They walk away with a ton of debt, and they wind up working unemployed. They're unemployed, right? And that's what happened. That was the whole impetus behind like some of the Arab Spring that we saw. People just not being able to get jobs, and to look at these populations and say, well, these people are all like they're essentially just shepherds, right? They're goat herders or something like that, and they live in these dusty places. That's in any country, right? But to assume that people are just committed to ignorance, I think is really, that's me on my soapbox, right?
Right.
Right.
And even Al Zawahiri in the Al Qaeda sort of worldview wants their people to be educated.
Right. And it's funny because bin Laden is educated and understands the ways of the West, right? Al-Zarqawi, not as educated, but still smart as a whip, educated in the ways of the West. This guy, educated, aware of the ways of the West, and understands the West in a way that he can. Even his mentor too talked about in the article. He went to the West and he studied in the West, right? So he studies in the West and he walks away with all of the things that like a bad taste, right? Like how the church. There's so many churches, but nobody's spiritual, right? There's no commitment. People in America care about money. They care about power. These generalizations that happen. They only want to have fun in church. They don't want to worship God or anything like that. And from the Muslim spectrum, you could look at those things and say, well, it's easy to judge, right? It's easy to sit there and look at it and say, well, according to Islam, you're all a bunch of heathens anyway, and here you are proving it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And basically, what then happens is because that's going on in the West, that's also going on in the Muslim world, and because the Muslim world had been colonized by the West,
right?
They're blaming the West for the presence of that,
right,
in the Muslim world.
Yeah, and al-Zawahiri's impetus for what was going on in Egypt was the fact that it had been, essentially run by the British, and it was that influence that was corrupting the government.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, what you're going back to here are some fundamental things in the sort of Orthodox Sunni worldview, and this is the idea of the fitra, is that everyone's born pure, and then it's external influences that turn someone into a Christian, a Jew, or a Sabian. Mm-hmm. So these external things come from outside, and they steer you wrong. So whereas from a Christian worldview, we wouldn't say that, let's say we have secular culture outside of the church. Mm-hmm. All that does is call out to the temptations already within people. We can't blame secularism
right.
for the failures of the church.
Right.
That he is correctly observing to some extent.
Right.
But it's not the fact that it's not the freedom of expression is not the problem for that. The problem is how we have not discipled our own people properly.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, first of all, anyone who thinks that anyone is born pure has never dealt with a pack of toddlers, right? Or even just looked at it and like the perception of, if the perception of sin is disobedience, what disobeys more than a kid like, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't touch that, right? And it's worse when an adult does that, but you know what I'm saying. It's just, the idea of being born pure, honestly, to me has always been like, that's silly. I know myself even, the idea of the thoughts and the things that I want, and all of the things that for instance, in those articles, where Katab is like in Colorado and judging the American people based on their behavior and its unspirituality. We're all like that, right? That's the whole point of a church. It's not that we come out and we're supposed to be this, self-righteous, holier than thou kind of people, and that's how we exhibit our spirituality. It's in brokenness is where you find Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like to some extent, some of what they're doing is judging Christians by Islamic standards as well.
Right.
Like they don't believe in dancing, and they're saying, well, look at these Christians going dancing.
Right.
Whereas King David dances before God at the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
It's a different outlook. So it's so having Christians dancing and playing songs is not because we're sort of morally loose and ignoring the Bible standards.
Right.
It's actually part of it. It's like we have a prophet who both sang, played musical instruments, and danced, and one of the Psalms commands, praise the Lord with loud clashing cymbals and stringed instruments.
Right. And I mean, I could look at them, so growing up in Islam and kind of having that filter, I could see where he would look at people like that and say, well, where's the piety, right? And I think that's the problem. There's this misunderstanding of what real humility is. And it's not necessarily expressed outward in outward piety. I mean, I knew plenty of Muslims growing up who were super pious individuals, and they, when it came to actually dealing with people, there was a lack of humility, right? There was an arrogance in some ways, and over stupid reasons, right? Like this person is born, like married to another person from another country, and then there's this disconnect because that person doesn't speak Persian. One spouse speaks Persian and the other one doesn't, like one speaks Farsi and the other one doesn't. Or one's born in one country and the other one's born in another country, and they're both Muslims.
Yeah.
But there's still like this, prejudice that exists towards, a neighbor or a brother that, even a Muslim would say shouldn't exist, right? But it does. And to ignore the fact that, there's a obvious lack of humility in judging your neighbor like that, is, I think, sometimes something that's like, when we talk about it in terms of radical Islam, it's totally swept under the rug.
So let's talk about Al Zawahiri in the framework of like the Pharisees in the Bible. So the Pharisees are like the Salafis of the Jewish world at the time. They are the people who are most devoted to the sort of scriptures and the sort of accurate interpretation of them, and had many good things going about them. So when the Hasmoneans invaded Edom and forced everyone to convert to Judaism, the Pharisees were the ones that stood up and said, no, you can't do that. That's not right.
Right.
So you have people with like genuine virtue. And I think Al Zawahiri is somebody who at some point has some genuine virtue. He is a man of integrity. He is a man
Sure,
of
absolutely.
commitment and dedication and consistency.
Right. We would all look at him and say he's earnest.
Yeah.
He believes what he believes, and he does what he walks the walk and he talks the talk.
Right.
It's his own talk, but yeah.
But yet that earnestness and that zealous code of following what he believes is from God eventually leads to the deaths of thousands of people in New York City.
Sure. I mean, going back to that Pharisee thing, there's a couple of things where you can say, the Pharisees, for instance, charged Paul with finding believers in Jesus and putting them to death, right? And to the point where the entire, first century community of believers at the time of Paul is afraid of him, right? And of course, we know the story of Paul. He has a power encounter with Jesus and is knocked on his arse, off his arse onto his arse, and has a salvation moment. Going back to the Pharisees that would have pushed that, it's important to keep a couple things in mind. We want that kind of power encounter to happen with people, particularly people who are kind of on a path to radical jihad, right? Paul was a zealous man. He was an earnest man, and God looked at his heart and said, I see you wanting to serve me, but you're wrong, right? Like, essentially, Jesus appears to him and says, why are you kicking against the goads? Goads are your shins. Like, why are you kicking? Why are you kicking your shins? Why are you causing yourself pain? And I think the other thing to keep in mind too with Paul and Jesus is, Jesus is more closely aligned with the Pharisees. The reason why he's always addressing the Pharisees is because essentially he believes what they believe regarding the resurrection, a lot of things, and is coming to break them of the error in their ways, right? It's more of calling them back to repentance. This is different, right? Because that level of observance, the mind that takes the step into where murder is okay, that should have been a breaking of conscience moment for Paul, right? I am prepared to condemn what they do, but I'm not prepared to kill them, right?
Yeah.
Like, sure, lots of things in the Torah about, stoning people, right? But if you go back and you look in the Torah, there's really no okay, and then they stoned this person because of the thing that they did. And there's not really anything in history where that happens. But he, on the other hand, takes this idea of Islam, and I mean, we've been studying the Quran as a staff, and taking these things that are in the Quran and saying, well, quite literally, we're going to do this, right? Like, quite literally, we're going to kill unbelievers.
And so here's the justification for how it happens, right? Because traditionally, the way jihad has worked, it has been a part of Islam historically, but it's always been in conjunction with a state.
Right.
What's different here is it's part of this international guerrilla movement that isn't connected to a state.
Right.
And so jihad in the classical sense would be armies fighting against armies of other nations for the most part.
Right.
And this is, yes, fighting against armies, but it's also fighting against civilians.
Right.
And here's the logic they use to get there. So Al Zawahiri's logic on why 9/11 is justified is this, that jihad is only justified with a caliph or unless there's mischief by foreigners in Muslim lands.
Right.
So they're going to say foreign soldiers in Saudi Arabia, in the land of the two holy mosques.
Right.
What more mischief could you have than that?
Right.
How is that not a provocation to war against Muslims?
Right.
And then, okay, well, what about civilians, right? So there's a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari that says the person who funds a ghazi, a warrior, has the same reward from God as a warrior.
Right.
So flip that around. The American taxpayer funding the U.S. Army
Right.
is now guilty to the same level that the U.S. Army is guilty of.
Sure.
And that's basically the reasoning they're using to justify the attack on the World Trade Centers and killing civilians.
Right. Sorry. It reminds me of that really bad X-Men movie with Oscar Isaac. Which one was it? Age of Apocalypse, where, he wants to destroy all humanity because they follow bad leaders, right?
Yeah.
He wants to wipe out all of the humans because they're A, not mutants, and B, they're following blind leaders. I always remember that line. you're blind because you follow blind leaders, right? Like, it's the same principle, though. You know, it's this idea that they're just as guilty because their leadership is guilty.
Yeah.
And therefore they have to be judged. Super sad.
And, to be fair, there's a kernel of truth in that.
Sure.
But who gets to judge that?
Well, I mean, this is so when we talk about what will actually fix the Middle East, right? You'd like to think that this idea of, maybe let's just engage in democracy more often, right? It kind of sets up this paradigm where there are winners and losers politically, okay? So there are things that my taxpayer dollars go to that I don't consent to. But because I participate in the system politically, I have an opportunity to voice my dissent, right? I think that's kind of lost in the theocratic mindset, particularly within Islam.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So in Jesus' life, you have a clear separation between church and state, at least in the roles they play.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible expects governments to obey God and enforce just rules.
Right.
And it expects Christians to follow God and organize the church properly.
Right.
But it's not the same set of people who are in charge of running everything.
Right.
So you shouldn't have like a pastor president. They have a different role.
Right.
Which I think informs our response to people like Al Zawahiri as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if I think about, okay, how would I want to respond to a person like this? Then how I want to respond to a person like this is with reason, is with persuasion, is with the gospel.
Right.
Believing that God can transform a man like this,
Right.
like he can transform the Apostle Paul.
Right.
However, that's my job as somebody who runs a Christian ministry, right? Is to seek that kind of ends.
Right.
At the same time, somebody who works for the state, their job should be to hunt down and destroy someone like this.
Yeah.
And those are two sort of jobs that are different.
Right.
And that this state is a necessary part of a broken world to solve problems like this.
Right.
But it only sort of it's only sort of clipping the head off a weed. Mm-hmm. It doesn't actually solve the problem. So force can't solve the problem. Education can't solve the problem. You have to have this heart level transformation to solve problems like this.
Right. And I think that's, something you could look at on a macro level and a micro level. So on a macro level, we can look at it as, there are plenty of testimonies of how when Christianity is introduced into a national ethos, right? As a whole, there are things like revival can happen. Okay, like in Guatemala, for instance, revival in Guatemala, revival in Colombia, revival in South America, revival in African countries, and how the fortunes of the country are changed because there is a turning of the national heart, right, towards God. You can see this in the Torah, different places where it says the heart of Israel was like one man, right, when they turned towards King David. Like it was, God led them to this place and they all turned there. And that's when these things that were awesome happened. And on a micro level, you can look at it and say, this is the thing when the individual turns, that this is when, marriages are healed, right? This is when people are, turned away from their evil ways, right? So that's that passage, Isaiah, let the wicked forsake their ways and the man of iniquity his thoughts, right? So this idea of this is what righteousness is, like in a nutshell. And the difference between the state, right? The model of the state and the model of, like, say, you and I, right? You operate a Christian ministry, or, any believer who's listening to this. There's a passage in the book of 1 Peter, okay? that says, Messiah came to save sinners. That is like a wise statement for us, right? This is why he came to do what he came to do. He came to save sinners. And we, as, believers and followers of that same Messiah, are to participate in that mission, right? He came to save sinners. That's why we're here, right? To grow as sons and daughters of God and to become his disciples so that we can participate in that mission. So it's clear, right? Messiah's mission wasn't to, hunt down terrorists. He does, because he's God and he executes justice, right? And we have to trust him with that. Like, vengeance is mine, says the Lord.
Yeah.
But for us, we're looking for the redemption.
Right.
Right? We're looking for the redemptive factor. We're looking for the healing of the world, for humanity to return to the Creator and be redeemed and restored. And in doing that, you can have a man like this, hopefully in the future, having that kind of encounter that Paul had, right? Turning away from that wickedness, looking at the earnestness of heart, and God looking at the heart and judging it, right? Like on a set of scales, and saying, I see where your heart is, and I'm going to stop you from doing this evil thing, because I see that you really want to serve me. And all of that revolves around knowing who I am, right? And that's where the revelation can come in.
Right. So Romans 12 very specifically says, brothers, do not avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God.
Right.
And then in Romans 13, it says that the state is an instrument of God to avenge evil.
Right.
So for the Christian, like, special operator or drone pilot or someone in the military,
Right.
they don't have to feel bad
Right.
about killing someone like this, because as a function of the state,
Right.
that's a legitimate course of action.
Right.
Whereas it's not my preferred course of action, right? It's not like the... So one of our board members, Mansour, put it this way. The world is better because this man is dead. But it's not as good as it could be is if he'd lived and repented.
That's a great way to put it. It's actually great. When I look at this guy, I see a lot of my dad. Like, they even kind of look alike at that age, and my dad was educated. My dad was politically active. My dad was a believer and a follower of Islam. He went to Mecca and, was well respected by all of the people around him, and had that same kind of, ability to put thoughts together and express them charismatically. And, I think that the world would have been better if he had turned to Messiah, but he never turned to violence, right? And I look at a guy like this, and I see that, what happens is there's almost like an apologetic stance that can happen towards, he's just trying to free his people, right? He's just trying to get rid of oppression. He's just trying to, be a good Muslim. That's not what a good Muslim does, right? Because that's not what a good human does. Like, you don't initiate the attack on the Luxor in 1997 and kill men, women, and children systematically for like 2 hours in a hotel. And I know that that's not good Islam, because it's not what my father would have done, who was a good Muslim, right? Do I wish that he had that encounter? Just like I wish that my father would have had that encounter, right? This idea that if they had seen God for who he really was, right? The Messiah, the Son of God, the Redeemer, the Healer, the one who died for their sin and is there to bring them into the afterlife, right? To bring them into relationship with God in this life, to restore them in this life, and to give them their ultimate restoration in the next life. What would the world be like now, right? If guys like my dad and guys like this, right? Two different ends of the spectrum. Neither one of them were fond of the West, right? Neither one of them were fond of American intervention. One does, my dad talks about it but never advocates violence. This guy talks about it and is all about, bringing the hurt and the pain. And I want to live in the world, right, where both of those guys accept Messiah. I want to live in the world where both of those guys know who God is, truly.
And so I think then the action and application point is here, is Christians need to have some bravery and so the state's job is to, go and blow guys like this up. Then our job is to go meet like this, persuade them, try and explain the truth to them. And we got to be brave.
Right.
Like the state's obviously fulfilled its mandate. Where are we?
Right.
So the thing that sort of hit me the hardest while reading the article about this guy's life is there's this moment, there's this guy that used to kind of have debates with him and you have like friendly conversations. But then there was just like a point where he said he just like shut off. He was no longer communicating an individual. He was like speaking to an audience that just wasn't even there. There's like this moment of like giving himself over this idea, this kind of point of no return.
Right.
And it's really, really important that we don't shy away from people like this and leave it to the military, that we actually are proactive, have these conversations,
right,
and trust God to show up in the midst of that.
Yeah.
And because the world's not going to get any better, the Middle East is not going to get better by military campaigns.
Nope.
Maybe a necessary short-term solution.
Yeah, that one day when we finally conquer Afghanistan and finally install democracy, right?
Right.
And have 1,000 years of peace,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's like, take notes, Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you guys are just doing the imposing of order wrong. Watch us try.
So, in closing, what would you say your final thoughts are?
I think my final thoughts are in the sort of generic historical sense, he was a great man.
Right.
But like all great men in history, his legacy ultimately was one that crumbled.
Right.
He didn't really achieve what he set out to achieve. He didn't accomplish the collapse of America. He definitely didn't achieve the collapse of the sort of Arab governments. I'd say Saudi Arabia, Egypt are probably in a sort of stronger position against the Islamists than they've ever been. And while Afghanistan certainly hurt America, it wasn't the complete collapse like the Soviet Union that he was hoping for.
Right.
And I think his dream of establishing a caliphate, died when ISIS kind of did the whole Leroy Jenkins thing and just and just like did it all too early.
Right.
So he was a man who was very cautious.
Right.
He was very, all right, wait for the right time. And ISIS just like, no, the right time is now, let's do this. And then they're gone a few years later.
Right.
And all the momentum's gone.
Right.
All these sleeper agents in the West, planted there by Al-Qaeda, were like, all right, come to Iraq and let's take over. And, they're all dead or in prison camps 10 years later. And I think a lot of his hard work crumbled before his eyes. And he built he got to see the Taliban take over his Islamic nation, but the West got him there.
Right.
And he died.
Right.
So I'd say it's a life of greatness wasted.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would look at the potential that was wasted there in a human being who, had great intelligence and honestly a sense of wisdom, right? But misapplied the entire thing.
Yeah.
And I think it's just down to like a fundamental disconnect between, how are you a doctor and then become so wise in killing people?
Definitely broke his Hippocratic oath.
Right. So, that's what I think. I think that it could have been, his life could have been used in so many different ways to bring people together, to heal people, and instead devoted himself to kind of embracing this this cruelty. And regardless of whatever people would say ideologically, right? I mean, that's to quote the dude, the Big Lebowski. That's just like your opinion, man.
So, as tempting as it would be to see this man as like Emperor Palpatine or Satan incarnate,
Right.
he is in fact an image bearer of God
Right.
and a sinner.
Right.
And
we
apart from the grace of God, we could all go there.
And we ought to be sad.
Yeah.
Sad that a human life was wasted in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, we say good farewell to Ayman Al Zawahiri, and we say farewell to this week's episode of Christ and Caliphate. We'll be back.
We'll see you next time.